Good afternoon again, and welcome to the afternoon session of the Humans to Mars Summit. This session coming up is called Maintaining Political Momentum, and Mike French, the Vice President of Space Systems at the Aerospace Industry Association, will be moderating. And this is a very important session. As we all know, sometimes it's difficult going from one administration to another, and even sometimes Congresses to another, to maintain consistency in the space program. So it's really, as we're in a presidential election year, it's very important that we work together in a bipartisan way to make sure that we don't make radical changes that'll derail all the progress we've made. Back during the 2016 election, Congress worked together and created the NASA Transition Authorization Act that helped prevent a major shift in policy. So we were able to continue many of the great programs that have led us to this point right now. So this is a really important topic. So I'm going to leave you off right now with Mike French from the Aerospace Industries Association. Mike.
Thanks, Chris. Really pleasure to be here today, and thank you for this opportunity. I want to introduce our panel. We've got a really good, solid panel here to talk about this topic today. I'm going to start first with Marcia Smith. Marcia Smith is the founder and editor of Space Policy Online and has more than 4 decades of experience in space policy, including at the Congressional Research Service and the Space Studies Board. All of us look to Marcia for her deep expertise on space policy and her assessments, especially on budgets and appropriations. Marcia, we're really glad to have you and your deep expertise on the panel today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Great, Marcia. And then second, we've got Jared Stout with us today. Jared's the Director of Congressional and Regulatory Policy at MBI, a boutique law firm that specializes in space and defense policy. Jared served as the Chief of Staff for the reconstituted National Space Council. He's also held numerous positions at the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation and in Congress as well on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Jared's going to bring to the panel recent executive branch experience, especially including during a transition and during the stand-up of the administration's current space policy. So Jared, looking forward to hear from you today.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here.
And last but not least, we've got Pam Whitney with us today. Pam's the staff director of the Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics at the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology in the U.S. House of Representatives. Pam's work directly oversees NASA, NOAA, and many of the important research and development activities that we care about in space. Her work is also responsible for developing the NASA Authorization Acts on the House side that Chris was just talking about. So Pam, great to have you, and looking forward to sharing your congressional experience and other experience with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Perfect. Well, why don't we get started? And just a reminder to folks, we're definitely interested in your comments and questions, and so we'll be monitoring those and bringing those into the discussion. But I'll start off with a few things, to set the stage here. And the first is, before we talk about maintaining political momentum, I think it's important to think about where are we today. And so, if I could, why don't we start with that? Would like to get your assessment of where we stand, sort of as a Congress, as administration and industry, sort of from a stakeholder perspective, as far as that consensus. And maybe, Pam, I'll start with you on the congressional side. If you could, give us your thoughts on how you all see things as where the current situation is from Congress.
Great. So yeah, I just want to say it's great to be here. Thanks for organizing this stimulating discussion. Before I continue, I'll just say that my comments are my own and don't represent any official position. But yeah, we're learning a lot about Mars. If we think of the Humans to Mars topic and the systematic approach to studying the planet with orbiters, landers, and rovers, and it's exciting to think about 3 probes that are scheduled to study Mars in the near term and continue our understanding of the planet. But getting to Mike's question about where we are today, I think I want to step back just a little bit and think about human exploration and where we've been. The broad goals for America's human exploration program over the past decades plus have been bipartisan and consistent through both Republican and democratic administrations and Congresses. Stemming back to after the Columbia accident and the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, there was a pretty clear look at long-term goals, and the administration and Congress set those goals for a moon to Mars as the next steps. And so through successive NASA authorization acts, going back to 2005, 2008, 2010, and 2017, the core goal of Moon to Mars as a stepping stone approach have remained. There have been some minor changes in focus in those acts, but the consistent approach and stepping stone of Moon to Mars has been very stable. So, when you look back at some of those acts, there's been a little bit of an evolution. You had in the 2010 Act direction for an independent study of human exploration, and that resulted in the National Academy's 2014 report, Pathways to Human Exploration. And that report found that sending humans to Mars should be the horizon goal, and that any interim human exploration destinations should focus on enabling the technologies and capabilities, in other words, feeding forward to the Mars goal. And then the Pathways report was important also because it informed work on the 2017 Act. And so while you see in that act the stepping stone approach remaining consistent, you also see somewhat more of some direct connections to the objective of human exploration of Mars. So where are we today? Those broad policy goals remain stable, consistent, and bipartisan, and that's important. The changes and emphases over those broad stroke goals tend to be on sort of more of the hows, maybe the implementation of the policy, timelines, technologies, partnerships, very healthy, very healthy evolutions and discussions and going forward. They don't divert from the strong and consistent bipartisan support for deep space exploration and for Mars as the goal. And if anyone has any doubt about the long-term goals, we have Representative Perlmutter's bumper sticker with a picture of Mars and the words, 2033, we can do this. That's always fun to see. So, and on more the near-term horizon, we have the NASA Authorization Act of 2020, introduced by Subcommittee Chairwoman Kendra Horn, with Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and Ranking Member Babin as original co-sponsors. And that bill authorizes a serious Moon to Mars program and what it will take to get there. And so the bill continues to reflect the longstanding approach of the Moon as a stepping stone to Mars, and consistent with the Pathways report, the bill is structured to focus on those lunar activities that feed forward and enable the goal of sending humans to the surface of Mars. And the subcommittee held multiple hearings, 9, across NASA's portfolio to inform the legislation. 2 of those hearings have in their title, Keeping Our Sights on Mars. So definitely a focus there. So in terms of the Hill overall, a lot of stable and consistent and bipartisan support and policy over the years. There's a Senate bill and a House bill, and we look forward to working with the Senate to get an enacted bill. And I'll just stop there.
Great, thank you, Pam. Well, why don't I switch over to Jared? Love to get, sort of a similar question. Where are we today? Maybe if you could give us the industry and sort of broader stakeholder perspective.
Sure, thanks. Thanks both to Chris Carberry and the whole team for putting this together. I think it's a great conference and really important to keep these conversations going. So, Mike, you asked me to talk a little bit about kind of executive branch and industry perspective. So I think maybe a good place to start really is just to keep in mind that as with almost anything that has to do with industry, the most important thing really is consistency and predictability. And so I think with any major development program, whether we're talking about a flagship science mission or we're talking about human exploration programs or anything like that, I think the key for industry is really that consistency and that what we oftentimes refer to as that constancy of purpose. And so I don't think that means that the government can't make changes to policy or strategy. And in fact, I think in many cases, changes to government strategy on acquisition or general policy are necessary. And I think, over the last 2 decades or so, we've seen some variability in that, whether if there are major changes in Congress or changes in the presidency. There have been some tweaks to general policy here and there, as Pam just mentioned. But I think overall, that constancy of purpose has really been kept moving forward in successive NASA authorization acts, and then generally speaking in executive branch policy. And I think that industry can be nimble. It can answer the needs of the customer in the case of civil space, NASA. But there should be, I think, a genuine effort by policymakers in Congress and in the executive branch to take into account the needs and the capabilities of industry partners. When we had the shuttle program, and that was a huge change to our workforce capability and the industry's ability to perform certain functions on behalf of the government. And I think when we make those major policy decisions, we have to have in mind what's going to come next and what's going to be our transition and how are we going to handle that transition. There's a lot of discussion going on right now about the International Space Station and what's going to happen with the ISS after, depending on where it gets extended to, whether that's 2028 or 2030 or some other date in the future. But having the most important part of that discussion, I think, is having a cognizant and a very real debate about what is going to come next and how are we going to handle that transition. So I think it's really important that policymakers and industry partners work together on those sorts of things. And so I think as we're looking towards the next decade of human spaceflight, certainly, I think what both the government, what both industry and the government will continue to benefit from is an open and honest dialogue about what it is that the government would like to get out of the human spaceflight program, what capabilities industry has to offer in furtherance of those goals, and then how long-term strategy can work in the best interest of our greatest national asset in this discussion, which is really our workforce. The workforce, those second and third tier suppliers that have developed their business models and their business around supplying the needs of specific national programs and national capabilities. Those things, I think, all have to be kept in the conversation. And so I think if we build off those pillars, we're going to continue to maintain our constancy of purpose that Pam was talking about through any political changes that are happening either in Congress or at the White House. But I think keeping our eye on those things is going to be really critical over the next decade as we look to make some of these decisions.
Great, thanks, Jared. Why don't I hand it off to you, Marcia? I'd love to get your sense of if you could provide us some historical context. We heard about strong bipartisan support from Pam, quite a bit of unity and different factors on the industry side. Would welcome your thoughts on how are we today? What's the, is this the roaring 20s? Where are we when we think about today and trying to maintain this versus other periods that you've looked at?
Well, I think the big change today, of course, is the role of the private sector and the fact that you have companies now and these billionaires who are willing to invest some of their own money. And I don't think we have seen that in the past. So when I look at the past, just the past 20 years or so, we did have bipartisan agreement from 2005 through 2008. Pam was talking about the NASA authorization laws that passed at that time. 2005 was a Republican-led Congress. 2008 was a Democratic-led Congress. And so you really did have a bipartisan statement, a policy that human exploration of the moon and Mars was something that we wanted to do in our future. And you still have that constancy of purpose that we want to do deep space human exploration, but the challenge has always been in the implementation and getting the money to do it. And so you do see these perturbations. And everyone is focused right now in September of 2020 on the presidential election because it's very close at hand, and thinking about how different presidents have changed the implementation, if not the policy, at least the implementation over the years. But it's important to recognize that just within this administration, we've had this big change, because for the first 2 years of the Trump administration, we were following this path. He had canceled the asteroid redirect mission, which skipped the lunar surface, and then President Trump signed Space Policy Directive 1 that put the lunar surface back in the plan. And we were doing that until March 26, 2019. And then suddenly everything changed because there was this 2024 goal and everything had to focus on that. So you can have these big perturbations in the implementation of it, which has funding consequences, even if you don't have a change in the policy. So I do think that there was a pretty big perturbation there last year when they put in this 2024 goal for getting humans back on the moon. And I think that Congress is still trying to figure out what to do with that. And so the House Appropriations Committee has not really put in a lot of money for that, some, but not as much as NASA wanted. And we have to see what the Senate's going to do. So there is the policy aspect of it that Pam and Jared were talking about. And I think there is this constancy of purpose that's still going on, that deep space human exploration is a good thing and we should do it. We should do it with international partners. All of that, I think that that is constant. But I think that there is this change with the deadline and this change with these new space companies coming along and how much they're going to be willing to do themselves. Suppose the government steps back. Back in the first part of the century, when you had all that bipartisan agreement, so you had Congress and the White House on the same page, Democrats and Republicans on the same page, it was a very different industrial environment then because industry was following government's lead. But now you have these companies like SpaceX that sort of have their own plans in addition to what the government's going to do. So I do see our current point in time as being different from the past. And I don't know how it's going to play out.
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting point about, sort of how you can have consistency in policy, but still these large changes on the implementation side. And I think that's quite interesting. And so why don't we, sort of thinking about that and now going to, sort of Chris's, how he kicked us off here with maintaining political momentum. So given all these different vectors, we'd like to hear from you all. And what are the tools? What are the mechanisms by which do we keep this constant purpose and or that have that have been successful in the past or that we think could be successful now? When I start, sort of Jared, you were in, from an executive branch position in kind of one of those changes that Marcia described. Why don't I start with you and get your thoughts on some of those tools for maintaining momentum?
Sure. So, the decision to do Space Policy Directive 1, redirecting the human spaceflight program at NASA back to the moon, was certainly, I think, a change in executive branch execution of that long-term stepping stone approach that has long been a consistent element of Congress's NASA authorization bills. I think I agree with Marcia that the 2024 date has put significant pressure on the implementation of those policies in a way that has not existed at NASA's human spaceflight program in quite some time. The key in my mind, and as a House guy, I often use the House's way of thinking about these things legislatively as kind of a benchmark for this. But I think the key on how you maintain that stability from the congressional perspective is ultimately Congress gets to decide how they're going to fund these things, and what they're going to authorize or not authorize. It's been a while since Congress, in a forward way, authorized funding for NASA. The appropriations obviously continue to come, but it has been a while since there's been a NASA authorization that did any forward leaning authorizations for funds, which really should be a guidepost for what type of policy is going to be implemented on the executive branch side. But I think ultimately Congress gets to decide. I think there was the great Senator Barbara Mikulski who said, not every president gets their own space program. And I think that from a congressional perspective is probably the way that you maintain that stability, is that ultimately, no matter what the president decides to put in a budget request, ultimately Congress is the one that gets to decide what that's going to look like and or what that authorization is going to look like. And so the executive branch, it really behooves the White House, OMB, NASA to work directly with Congress to find out what is the right mix of national goals and capabilities and policy before strongly moving out in any one direction or the other, to ensure that there is that support, because otherwise it all lags. The president and the executive branch may lead something, but ultimately, if Congress isn't there, then it's just not going to go anywhere. And we saw a little bit of that with the cancellation of the Constellation program and the follow-on, the SLS and Orion programs, and how Congress decided to handle that. Those can go a lot of different directions, but I think maintaining that stability is the responsibility of both the executive branch and Congress, but ultimately Congress is the one that's going to decide that, I think.
Thanks, Jared. So Pam, Jared just let us all know that you have one of the main tools here to maintain. So you're in charge of maintaining political momentum and stability for us, Pam. And so we'd love to just hear your thoughts on Jared's comments. Are the tools at hand, or are we at a different point where those tools are harder to use, easier to use? Love to get your perspective on sort of the Congress's role in this upcoming period.
Yeah, I think we've talked a bit about constancy of purpose and the role of authorization bills. Before getting into other specifics, I think there are some others that are worth mentioning, and that are important for the Hill and the public support, which ultimately affects funding and overall support and awareness. And those are, the inspirational value of space and NASA. It's essential for maintaining momentum and stability, the challenging and inspiring goals that lead to the nation's technological innovation, scientific discovery, economic, growth, and that attract the best and the brightest. That is an underlying factor in terms of maintaining momentum and stability and gaining that support that ultimately can be reflected in funding. Similarly, benefits to society, ensuring that we continue to communicate how our investments in space benefit our everyday lives is very important. It's another factor in building public support and allowing taxpayers to understand that the investments in NASA and the space program show up in their everyday lives, whether it's use of GPS applications and so many more. And then another one is international collaboration. That has been an element in NASA's program since the beginning. The ISS collaboration has lasted over 20 years. Many of our flagship missions like Hubble, Cassini, James Webb, and others have involved significant international collaboration, and those are important for sustaining support as well. And then, as Jared said, funding. Stable funding is obviously needed to accomplish goals and objectives. And those goals and objectives require clear plans and requirements. I think at the end of the day, Congress needs to have a clear idea of what it's investing in, what the plan is, and what it's going to cost.
Great, thanks, Pam. So really good, right? So a lot of tools here, I think, as we think about maintaining a human to Mars way forward, congressional side, the education, inspiration side, international partnerships. Wonder, Marcia, from your perspective, did we miss any or any secret sauce? Right? If we think about some programs like JWST that's gone through, quite a bit of development cycles and iterations, or the International Space Station, for example, going on 20 years of humans in space. Are there secrets there that folks interested in the Human to Mars program should be sure to capture?
It's interesting that you use the phrase secret sauce. So Pam brought up the 2014 report from the National Academy of Sciences, the Pathways report. Excellent report. If you haven't read it, you should read it. If you read it back then, you should read it again. It's got a lot of great wisdom in there. And Mitch Daniels, a former Republican governor of Indiana, was one of the co-chairs of it. And when he testified to Congress about it, and they were talking about public support, because I think Pam brought up public support, he said if there was any secret sauce to getting public support, it would have been used by now. So I think that the key tool, I think, is having harmony amongst all the different stakeholders in this. And the public is part of the stakeholders. Industry is a stakeholder. Republicans, Democrats, White House, Congress, they're all stakeholders. And you need to have harmony amongst all of those different elements in order to move forward. And again, not so much with the policy, because I think there isn't a lot of disagreement on the policy of human exploration of deep space. It's more the implementation plan and the pace at which you should go and how much the taxpayer dollars should be invested in this compared to other priorities. And I do think these are some of the very questions that Congress is going to have to be dealing with in the appropriations this year and in future years as we deal with the impacts of the pandemic and the trillions of dollars being spent on that and where the funding for NASA is going to be. There was a poll, a public opinion poll done, I think, a year and a half ago or so, where the public was asked about its priorities for NASA. What did it want NASA to do? And climate change was at the top of the list. And I think defending against asteroids was maybe second. But human exploration of the moon and Mars was really at the bottom of the list. So there may be some work to do in helping the public understand how some of these priorities that are so important to people on this panel and people listening to this conference, how those can help in these other domains. Because if you want to get the public coming along with you, then you need to respond to what their priorities are. So in terms of tools, you need to come up with a way to get everybody on the same page. And again, I think everybody was on the same page back in the first decade of this century. And things have changed since then, and you sort of need to get back on the same page again, because I'm not sure everybody is on the same page, other than on the long-term goal of, yes, humans to Mars. Yep, we all agree on that. But how do we get there? How much do we spend? What are the other priorities for NASA? I think there's still work to do there.
Great, thanks, Marcia. So, yeah, in the interest of reflecting on what does the public want, some really good public questions here from our audience. And I'll start with one here that touches, on the climate comment you also made. Question is, would like to get your view on the connection between space exploration technology and Green New Deal tech. Is this a useful linchpin for space policy development? So why don't I'll open that up, see if anyone wants to jump on that first. Jared.
Can I jump on it first?
Go for it.
Because I love this question. So I think it's that the connection between the space and technology development or the space technology development process and things that can be used back on Earth is really robust. We aren't always great at talking about it, although NASA really does, I think, a good job of providing publicly available information about how the technology that's developed for space exploration or just science exploration in general is definitely helpful back on Earth. And if you look at, for example, Space Policy Directive 1, the text of the policy says that as part of enabling that human expansion across the solar system to bring back to Earth new knowledge and opportunities, which I think is a really important aspect of that policy. But if we look at climate change as a whole, the issue of climate change as a whole, I think it's pretty obvious that as we continue to see the type of major global climate change that's occurring right now. For example, NASA just released some data about how the Greenland ice shelf had just lost enough ice to cover all of California in 4 feet of water, and that routine loss of ice is growing exponentially over the course of decades. That sort of data and the information that we're getting from our Earth science missions is critical to understanding how we implement policies for our country that can help to diminish the effect that we're having on our climate. And at the end of the day, the only planet that we know of in this universe that hosts life is our own. And so the more that we understand about our own planet and the effect that the climate has on us and we have on the climate goes a really long way towards helping us also understand how we might live on the moon or how we might live on Mars. Especially, for a planet where we believe at one point there may have been large amounts of water, and understanding what are the processes that perhaps led to the loss of that water and the loss of it being a habitable world. So I think the connection between the types of things that we could learn in green technology development through some of those efforts here on Earth and the types of things that we would or could develop for space technology is really critical and something that we really haven't explored yet fully, I don't think.
Thanks, Jared. No, great point there. I think, looking getting series of great questions. So I want to make sure I get to a lot of them here. Sort of another question that was raised, touching on a sort of big picture issue here. A question on how do we see China play? What's the effect of China as we look at the overall impact on the U.S. space policy development and what that might mean, for continuity. And maybe Marcia, if I could lean on you here to maybe if you have thoughts on that sort of international competition aspect of things versus collaboration, perhaps.
Well, of course, the Apollo program was driven by competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was very effective in promoting that competition and got us to where we wanted to be. And today, I think China has become that new competitor, and I think that helps some people when they're trying to explain why is it we need to send people to the moon and Mars. Well, we need to do it before China gets there. And you hear that a lot. I've heard it, over all these decades. Why do we have to do it? Well, because if we don't do it, somebody else will do it first. They'll set the norms of behavior, and we'll be in a weakened position. So I think that there is that competitive aspect to it. And I think China has taken over the role of Russia because Russia's space program is not as robust as it used to be. And they're actually a partner with us on the space station. So I think China has taken that role. But there are still some people who see China as a potential partner in this instead of a competitor. So NASA is working very hard in getting partnerships with all sorts of countries, but not China, because the Wolf Amendment doesn't allow them to do this kind of cooperation with China. But I think that there is at least a segment that would like to see us working with China instead of using China as a competitor and the explanation for why we have to do this program.
Yeah, and so I want to, sort of thinking about the impacts of things like Green New Deal, impact of China. Some we talked about in a lot of questions on what does a potential change in administration mean, for space policy, and it's obviously thinking about humans to Mars. Why don't I start there, right? I'd love to get, sort of initial thoughts on the panel. If we have a change in administration, are there things that we expect are sort of ripe for change or that might be barriers to continuity?
I can start with that. I think if we have a change in administration, I won't speculate on what happens, but we are aware that the Democratic platform has put out some statements of support for NASA and being committed to space exploration and discovery, continuing human exploration, and including its scientific and medical research, technological innovation, and that it's continuing to support strengthening the U.S.'s role in International Space Station and international partnerships, and continuing to work to return Americans to the moon and Mars. So this is what, and of course, I think we would expect, and is included, increasing focus on climate change and NASA and NOAA's work on improving our understanding of how the climate change is impacting our planet, much like Jared was talking about.
Yeah, no, thanks, Pam. Other thoughts on the panel on what does a President Biden mean for human to Mars or our space policy?
Yeah, Mike, if I could jump in. So on the Democratic platform, I really, which is kind of the best information I think we have so far from the Biden campaign. I think it, just like Pam said, a lot of the stuff that's in there is pretty consistent with long-term national goals and national policy. So I think there, at least, we'll have to kind of see if there's a change in administration, what that means in the long term, and what some of those things look like. But as Pam was talking, and as we've been discussing this over the last couple of weeks among us, I've kind of been thinking about space policy. Like, could I really, if I looked at two different space policies side by side, could I really say, oh, well, that's a Republican space policy or that's a Democratic space policy? And I think I would struggle to figure that out unless we were looking specifically at the implementation side of it. So as Marcia pointed out earlier, for example, the Obama administration would routinely request less money in planetary science and more money in Earth science, whereas the Trump administration, made cuts to education funding and to Earth science funding, but had increased astrophysics and planetary funding. So I think like some of the implementation things are different, but I think you would be really hard pressed to find a really obvious political difference in those sorts of things as they're Republican versus Democrat. I think it's much more either regionally based or just personal philosophy based, and depending on who happens to be in charge at any given point, which I think is really important on the congressional side. I don't think that we've ever seen as fruitful of a relationship on space policy on the congressional side as we saw between Senator Shelby from Alabama and Senator Mikulski from Maryland, or Senator Nelson from Florida and Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson from Texas. The relationships, the bipartisan relationships that those four senators had really defined the last decade of space policy from the congressional side. And I think it's important to think about it in terms like that there is a lot more in common than there is different in how these things move forward. Again, until you get to some of the implementation aspects of this, which I think Marcia has done a really good job of explaining.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jared. Some really, really good points. So Marcia, I don't know if you want to, provide any thoughts on what a President Biden would mean to space policy, or not, or I can jump to the next question. Up to you.
Well, I'll just chime in along with Pam and Jared and say that I think in terms of the policy, deep space exploration of the moon and Mars is a good thing. I wouldn't expect any change there. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a change in the implementation approach. I'm not sure if President Biden came in that 2024 would still be quite so important for getting humans back on the moon. So you might see a change in how it's implemented, but I still think that human exploration is very important. It's in the Democratic platform, and Republicans support it, and I don't expect a big change there.
Yeah, and weaving in a great question from the audience. We're, instead of all being in DC doing this panel face to face, right? We're all on this virtual platform because we face a pandemic, we face economic turmoil and economic impacts, budgetary impacts. Reports today on the deficit versus GDP. So given those realities, regardless of administration change, do we expect changes in space policy or space policy implementation just based on those fiscal factors? I'll have to start with you, Marcia. I got to start with you. Given your expertise on these topics.
Changes because of fiscal factors.
Correct.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a challenge to deal with the burgeoning. I say not even a good word for it. The exploding deficit. I think it's going to be a challenge to come up with money for something like human exploration, which people I think would view as something you could postpone for a couple of years until the economy is better. I think that there'll probably be more emphasis on NASA spending on climate because that is such a great concern to the people who are going to inherit the planet, and many of them are of tax-paying age and voting age these days. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a shift in emphasis. And I'm not sure that's dependent only on Joe Biden getting elected. It may change even if President Trump is reelected. So I think that the money, it's always about the money, isn't it? And I think it's going to continue to be all about the money and where the priorities are, national priorities and priorities within the civil space program. Yeah.
No, thanks for that. I think sort of kind of a corollary to that, I think maybe Jared, before I hand this one to you, is not just fiscal pressures, but, so we talked about a potential change in administration, but if you keep with the same administration, a second term, do these fiscal realities, or are there other factors where you expect to see some changes regardless, because, issues or other things becoming more ripe today than they were maybe a couple years ago?
Yeah, so I both love and hate this question. I think that it's really easy to see how with everything going on with the pandemic, that the economic pressure on our country is going to cause reevaluation of a lot of priorities. That said, I haven't seen a ton of evidence in the political system that large debt and deficit has been creating an untenable political environment for Congress. I don't think that I've seen a ton of evidence that the public is especially concerned about debt and deficit at the moment. And I haven't seen a ton of evidence that it is playing any significant role in members of Congress or of senators getting reelected. And so I think that's really hard to know for sure what the practical effect of that is going to be, because unless the president says that he's going to veto anything that creates a deficit or increases the debt, then it's really up to Congress to decide how much money they're going to invest in anything. And we're, of course, talking about investments in space as part of, the investments in other things versus investments in space. We're talking about space because it's our industry. But you could say the same thing about almost any other area of the federal government, whether it's agriculture subsidies or, fossil fuel subsidies, or I mean, there's a million things that you could put on that list, like why invest in those things rather than investing in these things. But I think it's going to be really hard to know what specific effect that economic pressure is going to have on larger budget trade-offs until we get through November and we see what is it that the public really cared about when they went into the ballot box, and number two, what was the effect of those priorities. I agree with Marcia that I think the growing climate change issues are going to have a major effect in the future. And as long as we continue to see some of these large-scale climate change effects, and I'm not talking about weather, I mean like over long periods of time, climate shifts, then I think we're going to continue to have discussions about that prioritization.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. So Pam, once again, everyone has put it on Congress in many ways. To answer these questions, what does your congressional crystal ball tell you on these things, Pam?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball, but I think in terms of the pandemic, we are in the middle of a pandemic. We don't yet know what the full impact is going to be. We're talking about space right now. So in terms of NASA, we don't have a clear understanding at this point what that's going to look like. And so I think we're kind of just at a juncture of maintaining the work now and sort of looking to get the information and data that we can get in terms of what the impacts are going to be. Overall, I agree that there may be some questions about priorities and in terms of economics and funding availability. There's been a lot of focus on the 2024 goal. That's one question that I would ask if the funding will be there given all the economic pressures we've been talking about. So I think we're gonna have to keep an eye on the pandemic, the impacts, and where the interests lie. We've got a lot of decisions that need to be made. The ISS transition was also mentioned. That's going to have to be looked at. So there's a lot to do.
Thanks, Pam. Just a fantastic question here from the audience that would love to get your thoughts on. Can you tell us what is the role that individuals, Americans as watching, this program, or our international friends as well? What's the role individuals can play in helping shape and support our space policy? Anyone want to jump on that first?
So I think Marcia might be in a good position to answer this, but I think, at least from my perspective, I was interested in space policy, and so I got involved in it, and I know that that's not an incredibly satisfying answer, but I've been involved in politics really all of my adult life, and most decisions are going to be made by people that show up and participate in the process. And so that may not be as much of a life decision as, oh, I'm going to go work for a member of Congress, or I'm going to go work for a federal agency involved in space, or I'm going to go, work for this trade association or something like that. It really could be as simple as, writing letters to the editor of your local paper. It could be, and for folks that think that maybe that's not that big a deal, I would just say, when I worked for our members, they very much cared about what their local papers were saying about things. So I think taking an active role and being civically engaged in your community, especially if you're in the Space Coast, or if you're in Houston, or if you're in Huntsville, or any place else where there's a major NASA center, taking a role and carving out a place for yourself to be a part of the public discussion is definitely a good place to start.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. Other thoughts on what individuals can do to be a part in helping shape space policy?
Well, I would like to just echo what Jared said, because I think it's really important for individuals, even if you're not working in the space business or anything like that, you're interested in it, talk to your friends about it, talk to your family about it, let them get excited about it with you. Not everyone's going to be, this just isn't everybody's cup of tea, but I think there are people out there who are really interested in things, and if you see a little article or something in the newspaper about something that piques your interest, send it on to somebody else. So I think there is a lot that the space cadets, if no one minds using that term, that space cadets can do in getting other people interested. I don't think I've ever met anyone who thought that spending on space was a waste of money entirely. They might argue about how much to spend, but I think that generally speaking, people think that learning about the universe and everything is a good thing to do. Again, they may argue about the money, how much, but I think that people are interested, and some are interested in astronomy, and some are interested in human spaceflight and whatever. But I think that for the average person out there, as Jared said, write your congressman or congresswoman, because they want to hear about it. Show up I imagine all the town hall meetings these days are virtual, but whether they're virtual or in person as the years go by, show up and ask questions about it, because that's another way that politicians know that their constituents are interested, because someone stands up in the audience and asks a question. So I think there's a lot that the space interested public can do to spur the interest in other people, where it's, like it's something they think about once every 6 years or something. Maybe they'll think about it once every 1 year. So I think there's a lot that people can do if they just try to share their excitement and their enthusiasm. Don't be overbearing about it, but just try to share it there, right on your block, right in your community, and show up at those town hall meetings when your congresspeople have them.
I'm going to jump in and just echo some of what Jared and Marcia said. Absolutely engage and ask questions. Seek data. Get involved in some of the, if you're truly interested in space, there are lots of either student groups or professional groups to bring you right in. But I would also encourage you to ask questions. There are a lot of interesting things happening. You hear about plans, big plans, 2024. I mean, think about what's behind some of those big themes and programs, and ask yourself, I mean, one of the things we have to think about is, is there a plan for 2024? We haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen evidence that it's doable. I mean, so start to ask the questions behind some of the interesting programs. There's a lot to learn, and engagement is encouraged.
Thanks, Pam. I know we're getting to the top of the hour here, so maybe I'll sneak in, try to sneak in one or two more questions here. Sort of an interesting question from the audience was, how does the other big policy change, if we think about space over the last couple of years, has been the development of the Space Force. And I want to focus on human to Mars, right? The focus here, but do we see Space Force as, does this overall benefit our ability to maintain momentum on the human exploration and science side? Is this going to be a distraction? Is it conflicting? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I will just bring up what my good friend Mike Gold often says. I just saw him speak earlier today at this conference, and he put up his PowerPoint slide of that he wants Star Trek, not Star Wars. And I think we're going to have to wait and see how much this Space Force thing feeds into a Space Wars kinds of thinking. The space doctrine that they just came out with is very broad and expansive. And you read their doctrine of what they think they're going to be doing in the future, and it looks like they're going to take over the entire solar system. I'm hoping that's not their intent, but I think that you can sort of read their doctrine that way. And I'm not sure, how far they're going to be going, portraying themselves as defenders of the universe for space commerce and everything. And I think that's going to be something interesting to watch as the years go by. So we'll see how the Space Force is still in its formulation stage, and I've listened to so many talks from General Raymond, and he does such a great job explaining what his vision is for the Space Force. But I was a bit surprised at how, and I'll probably get criticized for saying this, but a little heavy-handed the space doctrine was that came out of them. So we'll wait and see how it turns out.
Thanks, Marcia. Other thoughts from the panel?
So I think it's really important for us as a country to separate what our military does in space versus what our scientists do in space. There's obviously going to be some in between there when you start talking about commerce and independent citizens doing things in space. But I think that really kind of helps define the parameters of what our Article 6 responsibilities under the Outer Space Treaty to authorize and continuously supervise, how we handle our supervision and management of those citizens that are within our jurisdiction. It's one thing if we start saying things like, we think an adversary is going to the moon for the sole purpose of putting like a missile base on it or something like that. I don't think anybody's actually saying that. My point is that like there's a difference between encouraging the development of scientific and exploration progress at the moon and in asteroids and at Mars and that sort of thing, and then turning around and saying, well, and then we need a Space Force to protect it. I don't really think it works that way. I think those things operate independent of each other. And if the government makes a conscious decision to merge defense policy with exploration and science policy, I think it would be a significant shift in how this country has balanced those two sides of the utilization of space. And that would be worthy of a much bigger national discussion than just a branch of the military putting out a paper and saying, this is what we're going to do. I think it warrants a much bigger discussion than that.
Oh, go ahead, Pam.
I'll just add that, we established a separate civil space program, civil space agency from DoD functions. There's obviously overlap in terms of technologies and dual use and industrial base, but the clarity of those two functions is important. And I would echo some of the things that Jared said.
Great. Well, thank you all. Well, mindful of our time here and keeping the program along. And so just want to thank you for your insights. I think hopefully for the audience, we were able to give some historical context of where we are today, some of those tools that we've seen work to maintain political momentum, and some of those areas where we think we'll be able to see that continuity and perhaps some areas that may influence change going forward. So very much appreciate the panel's insights. Maybe we'll come together in a year from now and see how we did. Thank you all.